Welcome to Business Insight. I'm Peter Marks. My guest today is Keith Rollag. He's Associate Professor and Head of the Management Division at Babson College. He's also author of the new book, What to Do When You're New. Keith, it's great to have you back.
Great to be here today. Thank you.
So tell me, what prompted you to write this new book?
Well, I've been studying sort of newcomers and the newcomer experience, especially in companies, for probably the last 20 years. And I found through my research and in talking with hundreds of people that oftentimes the real challenge that people have when they enter into a new job or a new opportunity is less sort of all the strategies of getting ahead, and sometimes it's just simply overcoming the fear we have of new situations and interacting with strangers and building relationships. So those fundamental skills that we need to feel comfortable when we walk into a room full of strangers or a new team or new customers or whatever we need to interact with to be successful. So I wrote this book partly just to help people understand why they get nervous in new situations, and then more importantly, how can they get better at several key skills so that they can enter into new situations with more comfort and confidence, and more importantly, maybe go out there and attend that networking event that they might have talked themselves out of otherwise.
Well, let's
move forward from there.
Let's zero in on that.
Okay.
What happens at networking events?
So, when I've talked to a lot of people about networking events, they recognize, yes, they're important, but at the same time, most people don't necessarily, they get nervous about it. Walking into a sea full of strangers, all these strange faces, is daunting for anyone, even the most extroverted. It's a nervous situation. And in fact, other researchers have found that when we go into those situations, our natural tendency is to go see whatever familiar face we know, go over there, say hi to them, and then spend most of the event talking to that person rather than doing what we thought we were intending ourselves to do, which is to go up and meet new people, build new relationships. And that is sort of common to pretty much everybody. And yet, the crazy thing is that most times when people do have the courage to go up and interact with somebody, they introduce themselves, it usually goes really, really well. But somehow, the next time, we're still nervous again. So part of this book was to help people understand why they're still nervous after doing this thousands of times, and then more importantly, what can you do about it?
And so what can you do?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that we are hardwired in many ways to be nervous around strangers. Because for much of human history, meeting strangers is a very rare and often somewhat dangerous event because we lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers of 30 to 40 people, and by definition they were spread out quite a ways apart. So when you met a stranger, it usually meant they were either encroaching on your territory or you were encroaching on theirs. And so there was a survival advantage to be nervous in those situations because it was a rare and yet potentially dangerous event. The challenge is we've inherited a brain that's primed for that in a world where we meet strangers every day. In fact, the average person, just commuting to work might encounter several hundred strangers, which is more strangers than our ancestors met their entire life. So we're just not hardwired, you might say, to be comfortable at it. The good news is we can overcome that and get better at it. But I think for a lot of people, just recognizing that they're normal, there's not something wrong with them when they feel nervous in these situations, is often sort of releasing to some extent.
And what do you do once you're walking in the door to this networking event? Or maybe you do things before it.
Sure. Well, obviously, there's a number of things. If you know who's going to be there, and if you can study some of the names and bios of people, that obviously will make you more comfortable because you sort of have some advanced information. The other thing you can do is rather than approach it as a performance. A lot of people were sort of trained in school to think of it in terms of a social performance, and really think of it as a learning opportunity. If we think of it as a make or break performance, and every single person we meet in that networking event is going to be, is going to determine our future fate and career success, we're putting an enormous amount of pressure on ourselves. But if we can approach it as more of an opportunity to learn interesting things about people. And after we've done that, we'll kind of move the conversation into potential job opportunities and such. But if we can focus more on the learning rather than the performing, a lot of people have found that reduces a lot of that anxiety, and it may still be challenging, but it goes easier. And for most people, it's that first approach, right? Once you're into the conversation, it isn't as bad. It's just overcoming that reluctance to go up to somebody you don't know and say, "Hi, my name is."
Well, speaking of names, one of the things that drives me crazy is either I never get around to asking the person's name, and even if I do, I never remember it. What can you do to remember names?
Right. Well, it turns out that feeling is pretty much common to almost everybody. There are very, very few people out there who are actually really good at remembering names. Most of the people I've interviewed over the years are kind of like probably you and me, which is we wonder what's wrong with us. You know, we can meet somebody, and 5 seconds later, if someone asked us what their name was, we wouldn't know, right? The first thing to recognize that's normal. The second thing is to understand that our brains simply aren't, again, wired to do this well. For much of human history, we didn't have names. And the way that our brains process proper names, like Peter or like Keith, turns out to be different than how we process almost every other piece of information we learn about people. And in some ways, we even store it differently. So the connection between what we know about people and the name is pretty weak initially. And what happens in most of these events is, the first thing we learn about somebody is the name. And of course, in that first few seconds, we're nervous, we're thinking about our handshake, we're thinking about what we're going to say. There's so many other things competing for attention. And research has found that probably in half the time when we forget somebody's name, we never really heard it that well in the first place. So in terms of how do we get better at it, the first part is to make a habit to remind yourself to, I'm going to listen for that name. Repeating their name right afterwards. So if we introduced ourselves and I said, so it was Peter, right? Great to meet you. That reinforces it in the brain. As we're talking, sort of mentally quizzing yourself in those moments when you can to say, all right, what's his name? What's his name? And if at the end of the conversation you've discovered you still don't remember it, it's always a great opportunity just to say, hey, and just again, your name was, or lead it by, and by the way, again, my name was Keith, and your name was? Because usually, in most of those situations, number one, they're flattered that you're willing to ask for it, but number two, they've already forgotten your name, so by repeating yours, you've actually, probably thanked them as well. And then the most important thing you need to do is write that name down after you've met somebody, because our ability to recognize the right name is much, much better than our ability to try to pull that name out of the memory in the heat of the moment. So if you can keep these names somewhere, whether it's on a phone or a pad of paper or whatever, obviously if you know you're going to be running into a group of people, you can study those names again. But sometimes, and I've done this before, I see somebody coming, in an event, I can't remember their name, so I can sneak off to the bathroom and kind of look at that list. And again, our ability to recognize the name is so much better. So even though I can't remember their name, I can remember that I met them last Thursday and they have 3 kids and they live in the town next door. I can't remember their name, but show me the list and instantly most people can recall it and saves a lot of embarrassment. But again, the more you practice, the more comfortable you can be, and people can get better at remembering and learning names.
Another area that can be uncomfortable and it's pretty important to everybody is you're new on a job and you're trying to build relationships. And what's the best way to make that happen when you're new in an organization?
Sure. Well, part of the challenge is there's sort of been a long-standing expectation that somehow to meet new people you've got to be introduced, right? There's sort of, in fact, in our etiquette books, there's lots of rules about how do you introduce other people. But there's almost no rules in etiquette books about how to introduce yourself. So we are often relying upon either our boss or other people to either take us around and introduce ourselves or approach us proactively and introduce themselves to us. But often that doesn't happen. And people are reluctant, Yeah. And so I think the first thing one has to overcome when you're new to a position is to realize that as a new person, you kind of have the implicit right to go up to pretty much everybody and introduce yourself. And it's a whole lot easier to do it in the first few days and weeks than weeks later, because I've found in many cases people feel if I've sort of become aware of somebody in the office, we haven't been introduced, it becomes more and more awkward. Yeah. And once you're into that phase, then both parties are sort of awkward. So I think one of the important parts is to recognize that much of your future success is going to be built upon the relationships you create. A lot of people come into a new job and say, I got to hunker down and I got to spend all my time doing that job that I've been given to do really well and make a good first impression. And while that's important, oftentimes it's the relationships you build and the information and the help that you get through it that's ultimately going to make you more successful. So sort of overcoming that natural fear of all these strangers around you and being willing to not only introduce yourself, but then follow up, ask them to coffee, do all the things that you like other people to do for you, and it'll make a big difference.
What are some ways one can practice before you're in a new organization, before you're at the networking event? What can you do just kind of perfect your skills when it's not quite as much pressure?
Sure. Well, if you think about it, these basic kinds of skills, whether it's introducing yourself, whether it's remembering names, asking questions, building relationships, they are skills, and you can practice those. And as you said, yes, there are times where it's really critical. That job, and you're meeting your boss for the first time. I mean, those are pretty important events. But we meet hundreds of people all the time in our lives, outside of life. If you're uncomfortable introducing yourself in work situations, well, introduce yourself to some of the neighbors that walk by that you haven't, gotten around to going to, or the person who sells you coffee every morning at Starbucks. Or, again, I've had many people, especially introverts, who have gotten comfortable at this, and they all tell me that it's really a matter of practice. It's doing it enough times, but more importantly, reflecting on it so that you realize and you sort of recalibrate your brain, convince your brain that it isn't as scary, and the outcome and the risk that you're taking is a whole lot less than our brain wants to make us think it is, and just go for it.
We've got a lot of new technology every year, social media.
Mm-hmm.
How does that bear on this whole issue of being new?
Well, on one hand, it's a benefit because obviously now almost everybody in the world is within reach in terms of building a relationship and all the great things that come from our ability to maintain extended relationships with family and friends through Facebook and other things. The challenge is in terms of new situations, is it's become almost a substitute for building new relationships. And I'm sure many people have had the experience of being, for instance, if you're a parent and standing on the sidelines of a sporting event watching your kids, in the old days, all you could really do is to watch the event. And so you might have introduced yourself and talked to the other parents. Unfortunately, these days, we carry with us one device that is, basically eliminates a lot of the chance or possibility for people to meet relationships, and that's the smartphone. Because rather than taking the opportunity to meet with somebody standing next to you, you just maintain all the relationships that you already have through that phone, and now rather than introducing yourself, you just see everybody with their heads down in their smartphone, and it becomes a substitute. So the path of least resistance is, no, I'm not going to introduce myself to the person next to me. I'm just going to continue chatting with the person that I already know. And as a result, you don't build the relationships that truly would make that situation much more enjoyable and fun. So while they're great events, social media, the reach that we can get by asking questions, building relationships is great. Just be careful that it doesn't become your substitute for building the relationships that really will get you the success and happiness you're looking for.
Well, as you pointed out, this whole issue of challenges being new has been around since mankind.
Sure.
What do you envision 5 or 10 years from now, this impact of social media? You think it's going to be easier, worse? People are going to totally avoid it? What's your futuristic view of this whole issue?
I think in some respects it could get more challenging. So if you see the advent of virtual reality, for instance, to where now rather than simply communicating by text or by email or by phone, if we can suddenly find both of us in an immersive environment where we are conversing and seeing each other much like we are now, then we're coming full circle right back to the face-to-face interactions that people feel a little uncomfortable for. When that virtual networking event becomes a immersive virtual reality where we come into a room and we see everybody else, all the research suggests that our brain will interpret it just the same as it interprets reality, and we're just going to be as nervous. So to think that we're going to get somehow this is going to get easier, I think in many respects it'll become more challenging because again we won't be able to rely on the simplicity that comes with text and email or phone. We're back to face, which is great and wonderful, but we still have to have these challenges.
Well, it's so interesting, and it's important for everybody all the time. For people that want to learn more, I suggest they read the book, What to Do When You're New, by Keith Rollag, for business insight. I'm Peter Marks. Thanks for joining us.